Have you ever felt like you're searching for something more in life, something deeper, yet no matter how much you achieve, success, wealth, or recognition, you still feel empty? What if the answer has been in front of you all along? Jesus revealed a powerful truth that goes against everything the world tells us about success and fulfillment. He taught that real purpose isn't found in self-promotion, but in surrender. Not in taking, but in giving. Not in seeking recognition, but in serving others. Through his words, we uncover the key to overcoming the void inside and stepping into the life we were truly created for. Today, we will explore the 10 most powerful teachings of Jesus that can transform your life forever. Where are you watching from? Share in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more inspiring stories like this. Now, let's begin. The night was unusually quiet. The distant hum of the city seemed muffled, swallowed by the weight of the questions swirling in Ethan's mind. He sat alone on his small apartment balcony, staring at the skyline, the lights of the towering buildings flickering like distant stars. He had everything the world told him would bring happiness: an impressive job, a sleek car, a luxurious apartment. But inside, he felt a hollow ache, an emptiness he couldn't explain. "Is this all there is?" he whispered into the night. Ethan had spent years chasing success, climbing the corporate ladder, impressing his peers. He had worked tirelessly, proving his worth through accomplishments, believing that once he had enough, he would finally feel complete. But the more he achieved, the more he realized how little it all meant when he lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, his heart weighed down by something he couldn't name. That evening, as he scrolled mindlessly through his phone, a video caught his attention, a message about purpose, fulfillment, and the words of Jesus. He almost kept scrolling, but something made him stop. He tapped the screen, and the voice of the speaker filled the room. "Have you ever felt like you're searching for something more?" the voice asked. "Like no matter what you do, no matter how much you achieve, there's always an emptiness inside you? Maybe you've been looking in the wrong places. Maybe the true purpose of your life has been right in front of you all along." Ethan's heart pounded. The words struck a nerve, unraveling years of suppressed doubts. He leaned in, listening as the speaker continued. "Jesus once said, 'For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it.'" Matthew 16:25. It sounds paradoxical, doesn't it? But what if true fulfillment isn't found in chasing our own desires, but in surrendering to something greater? What if real purpose isn't about what we gain, but what we give? What if the peace we seek is found not in self-achievement, but in following the one who created us? Ethan swallowed hard. He had always brushed aside faith, considering it something for the weak, for those who needed a crutch to get through life. He was self-made, strong, independent. But tonight, as he sat in the dim glow of the city lights, he couldn't ignore the longing in his heart. He thought back to the years he had spent tirelessly working, convincing himself that the next promotion, the next big deal, the next luxury purchase would finally be enough. But they never were. Instead, he felt more restless, more uncertain, more disconnected from himself than ever. As the video played on, the speaker shared a verse from Ecclesiastes. "He has set eternity in the human heart." Ecclesiastes 3:11. It was as if the words were written for Ethan himself. He had spent his whole life trying to fill a void that only something eternal could satisfy. Tears welled in his eyes. He wasn't even sure why. Maybe for the first time in years, he was beginning to understand what his heart had been trying to tell him all along. As the video ended, the speaker issued a challenge. If you've been searching for meaning and coming up empty, what if it's time to try something different? What if it's time to seek the purpose that Jesus has for you? Ethan hesitated, his fingers hovering over the screen. Then, almost instinctively, he whispered, "God, if you're real, show me." And for the first time in a long time, he felt something he couldn't explain, something deeper than emotion, more profound than logic. It was a stirring, a whisper in his soul. Hope. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that had settled deep inside him since watching the video. It lingered, weaving through his thoughts, stirring questions he had spent years avoiding. That night, sleep felt like a distant luxury. Every time he closed his eyes, the words echoed in his mind. What if the peace we seek is not found in self-achievement, but in following the one who created us? By morning, the city outside his window was already alive. Horns honking, hurried footsteps clicking against the pavement, people rushing to chase another day. Ethan sat at his kitchen table staring at his untouched cup of coffee. For years, he had been one of them, a man on a mission, running from one success to another, convinced that purpose could be measured in promotions and paychecks. But now he wasn't sure what he believed anymore. A notification lit up his phone. It was a text from his old friend, David. "Hey man, it's been a while. I don't know why, but you've been on my mind. Want to grab coffee later?" Ethan hesitated. David was different. He had always been steady, grounded in a way Ethan had never understood. There was a quiet peace about him, a confidence that wasn't built on wealth or status, but something else, something deeper. Ethan had always admired that about him, even if he never admitted it. "Yeah, let's meet up." Later that evening, Ethan found himself sitting across from David in a cozy cafe. The rich scent of roasted coffee filled the air, blending with the hum of quiet conversations around them. David smiled, setting his cup down. "You look like a man with a lot on his mind." Ethan let out a dry chuckle. "You could say that." He paused, then exhaled. "David, have you ever felt like you had everything you wanted, but it still wasn't enough?" David's expression softened. "More times than I can count." Ethan looked up, surprised. "You? But you always seem like you have it all figured out." David shook his head. "I don't, but I do know this. Chasing success, relationships, approval, none of it ever truly satisfies. Not the way we think it will." Ethan leaned in. "Then what does?" David took a deep breath. "Jesus." Ethan tensed. He wasn't sure what he expected, but the directness of the answer caught him off guard. "I used to be like you," David continued. "Always running, always searching, always feeling like the next big thing would finally make me whole. But the truth, the emptiness, never left, until I realized I wasn't made to find fulfillment in temporary things. We were created for something more, and the only one who can truly fill that void is God." Ethan swallowed hard. "But what if I don't even know how to believe?" David smiled. "Then start by asking. Jesus said, 'Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you.' Matthew 7:7. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to take the first step." Ethan sat back, his mind racing. Could it really be that simple? Just asking? As he walked back to his apartment that night, the city lights blurred against the darkness, and for the first time in years, he whispered a prayer. Not polished, not perfect, just raw and real. "God, if you're really there, help me see you." And deep within his soul, something stirred. Ethan couldn't shake the weight of that night. The quiet prayer he had whispered into the darkness, the way his heart had stirred in response. It wasn't something he could explain, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a pull towards something beyond himself. The next morning, his phone buzzed with another message from David. "Hey man, I was thinking, would you want to come to church with me this Sunday?" Ethan stared at the screen, conflicted. Church? It wasn't his thing. He had never been the religious type, and the idea of stepping into a place filled with people who seemed to have their lives all figured out made him uneasy. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to type out an excuse. But then, almost instinctively, he heard David's words from the night before. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened to you. What did he really have to lose? Yeah, I'll be there. Sunday morning came faster than he expected. Ethan stood outside the church doors, shifting uncomfortably. The building was simple yet welcoming, with warm brick walls and large glass windows that let in the morning light. He hesitated before stepping inside. The sound of soft music filled the air, and the hum of quiet conversations surrounded him. People greeted each other with smiles, some embracing like old friends, others offering warm handshakes. David spotted him and waved. "Glad you made it." Ethan nodded, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Let's see what this is all about." They found seats near the back as the worship team began to play. The music was unlike anything Ethan had expected. It wasn't forced or theatrical. It was heartfelt, filled with emotion. The lyrics spoke of grace, redemption, and a love so deep it defied understanding. As the pastor stepped up to speak, Ethan leaned forward slightly, trying to prepare himself for the sermon. But what he heard caught him completely off guard. Many of us go through life chasing things that were never meant to satisfy us. We think success, money, relationships, or achievements will finally make us whole. But the truth is, we were created for more than this world can offer. Ethan's heart pounded. The pastor continued. Jesus said in John 10:10, "I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." He didn't come to give us a list of rules or religion. He came to offer us a new way to live, a life of purpose, peace, and relationship with Him. A lump formed in Ethan's throat. He had spent years searching for meaning, and here was this pastor, speaking words that echoed the very questions Ethan had been asking. Then came the part that made Ethan's breath hitch. Maybe you're here today and you feel lost. Maybe you've been searching for something, but nothing has filled that empty space in your heart. Jesus is inviting you, just as you are, to come to Him. Ethan clenched his jaw, overwhelmed by a wave of emotions he hadn't expected. David glanced at him. "You okay?" Ethan exhaled shakily. I don't know." David smiled knowingly. "That's a good place to start." Ethan sat alone in his apartment, staring at the city lights beyond his window. The church service had ended hours ago, but the words still echoed in his mind. Jesus is inviting you, just as you are, to come to Him. He wanted to believe it, he really did, but something inside him resisted. A war waged in his heart. One side whispered, "Maybe this is the answer. Maybe this is what you've been searching for all along." The other side scoffed, "Are you really going to throw away everything you've built for something you don't even understand?" He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "God, if you're really there, why is this so hard?" he muttered into the silence. It wasn't that Ethan didn't want to believe. It was that belief required surrender, and surrender had never been his strong suit. He had spent his entire life in control of his career, his image, his success. Giving that up, even to God, terrified him. His phone vibrated on the table. It was David. "David, hey man, I know today was probably a lot. Want to grab dinner and talk?" Ethan hesitated, but then replied, "Ethan, yeah, let's meet." Later that evening, they sat across from each other at a quiet diner. The smell of grilled food filled the air, but Ethan had barely touched his meal. David took a sip of his drink before speaking. "You're struggling." It wasn't a question. Ethan let out a dry chuckle. "That obvious, huh?" David smiled. "I get it. It's a big step. But can I ask you something?" Ethan nodded. David leaned in slightly. "What are you afraid of?" Ethan exhaled, staring down at his hands. "What if I'm wrong? What if I let go, trust God, and it turns out to be nothing? What if I lose everything I've worked for and end up with nothing?" David nodded thoughtfully. "I used to feel the same way. But here's the thing. Jesus never asked us to understand everything before trusting Him. He simply said, Come, follow me. Matthew 4:19. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about taking the first step, even when you don't see the whole path. Ethan swallowed hard. But what if I fail? David smiled. Then welcome to the club. We all fail. That's why grace exists. Jesus never said we had to be perfect. He just calls us to trust him. Look at Peter. He literally walked on water with Jesus, but the moment he started doubting, he sank. But guess what? Jesus reached out and pulled him up. That's who God is. Ethan was silent for a long moment. Finally, he looked up. So, what do I do now? David leaned back, his expression kind. Ask him. He's already been knocking at your heart. The question is, are you ready to open the door? Ethan sat in his car outside his apartment, gripping the steering wheel. The conversation with David had shaken him, stirring something deep inside that he could no longer ignore. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest. For years, he had built his life around control, meticulously planning every career move, every financial decision, every relationship. But now, for the first time, he faced something he couldn't manipulate or predict. Faith. It wasn't logical. It wasn't something he could measure, and yet the pull was undeniable. He exhaled, leaning his head back against the seat. The words from Matthew 11:28 surfaced in his mind, words the pastor had spoken at church. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Rest. That was what he had been searching for all along, wasn't it? Not just physical rest, but something deeper, the kind of peace that silenced the restless ache in his soul. He closed his eyes and whispered, God, I don't know how to do this. I don't even know if I have enough faith. But if you're real, if you're really there, show me. I'm tired of running. Silence. No thunder. No voice from heaven. Just the quiet hum of the city around him. But something inside him felt different. A lightness. A shift. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. Ethan opened his eyes. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, he didn't feel like he needed them. Instead, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. The next morning, Ethan found himself walking through the park, sipping a cup of coffee, his mind still turning over everything. Mind if I join you? Ethan turned to see David standing beside him, smiling. Ethan chuckled. Do you just have a sixth sense for when I need someone to talk to? David laughed. Let's just say I know what it's like to wrestle with faith. Ethan nodded, his gaze distant. I prayed last night. David's expression softened. How did it feel? Ethan hesitated. Strange, but good. I didn't hear a voice or see a sign, but I felt something. Like I wasn't alone. David smiled. That's how it starts. God rarely speaks through thunder and lightning. Most of the time, it's in the stillness, in the quiet moments when we finally stop trying to do everything on our own. Ethan took a deep breath. So, what now? David's eyes twinkled. Now. Now you walk forward. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting the one who does. Ethan let those words settle in his heart. He didn't know where this path would lead, but for the first time, he was ready to find out. Ethan had stepped forward in faith, but faith is always tested. It started small, a delay at work, a misunderstanding with a friend, an unexpected expense. He brushed it off, reminding himself that life was unpredictable. But then, everything seemed to unravel at once. That Monday, his boss called him in. Ethan, I need to be honest with you. The company is downsizing. We're letting some people go. Ethan's stomach twisted. Am I one of them? His boss hesitated. Not yet, but things are uncertain. I just wanted to give you a heads up. Ethan nodded, but as he walked out of the office, his mind raced. He had worked tirelessly to build his career. Losing his job wasn't an option. week later, his landlord called. "Ethan, I hate to do this, but I'm raising the rent starting next month. Costs are going up." Ethan clenched his jaw. "How much?" "Another $400. The number hit him like a punch to the gut. Between that and his shaky job situation, he felt like he was standing on a crumbling foundation. For the first time since he had prayed that night in his car, doubt crept in. That evening, Ethan sat across from David at their usual diner, stirring his coffee absently. "I don't get it," he said finally. "I took a step of faith. I'm trying. Shouldn't things be getting better?" David leaned back, studying him. "You remember the story of the disciples in the storm?" Ethan exhaled. "Yeah, Jesus was asleep in the boat while they panicked." David nodded. "Exactly. And what did they do?" "They woke him up, accused him of not caring." David smiled. "And what did Jesus do?" Ethan hesitated. "He calmed the storm." David pointed at him. "But before that, he asked them, 'Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?' Mark 4:40. Ethan let the words sink in. David continued, "Ethan, faith doesn't mean life gets easier. It means we trust God even when it doesn't make sense. The disciples had Jesus with them, yet they still panicked. But Jesus was never worried because he knew the storm wasn't stronger than him." Ethan swallowed hard. "So you're saying I should just trust?" David grinned. "I'm saying you already know who's in your boat." That night, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He didn't have answers. He didn't have control. But for the first time, he realized he didn't need either. He whispered into the darkness, "God, I don't know what's coming next, but I choose to trust you." And with that, he finally closed his eyes, at peace in the middle of the storm. Ethan thought he had surrendered his worries to God, but faith isn't truly faith until it's tested in the fire. A week after his conversation with David, the worst happened. He lost his job. The news came suddenly: an impersonal email, a severance package, and a final paycheck. Just like that, everything he had built was gone. He sat in his apartment, staring at the termination notice in his hands, his heart pounding. Fear crept into every corner of his mind. What now? He had bills to pay. Rent had just gone up. His savings wouldn't last long. And worst of all, he had trusted God. Wasn't that supposed to mean something? That night, Ethan found himself driving aimlessly, hands gripping the wheel, frustration bubbling under the surface. He pulled into an empty parking lot, killed the engine, and slammed his hands on the dashboard. "This isn't fair, God," he shouted into the silence. "I trusted you. I took a step of faith, and you let me fall." Tears burned his eyes, and for the first time in years, he felt completely lost. Then, a memory surfaced. The words of Job, a man who had lost far more than Ethan could imagine. "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Job 1:21. Ethan clenched his jaw. How? How could Job still bless God when he had lost everything? Ethan sat there, wrestling with the question, his breath coming in uneven gasps. He thought faith meant things would work out the way he wanted. But maybe faith meant trusting even when they didn't. Through his exhaustion and anger, he whispered, "I don't understand, God, but I don't want to turn away. Help me." The next morning, he woke up feeling different. Not fixed, not happy, but determined. He sent out resumes, made calls, swallowed his pride, and asked for help. It wasn't easy. The waiting, the rejection, it all tested him. But something was changing inside him. He was learning to let go, to stop demanding answers and start walking forward even when he couldn't see the road ahead. And one day, after weeks of searching, the phone rang. "We'd like to offer you a position," the voice on the other end said. It wasn't what he expected. It wasn't glamorous, and it paid less than his old job, but it was enough. And for the first time in his life, Ethan realized enough was more than he had ever needed. Ethan had made it through the storm. He had lost his job, nearly lost his faith, but in the end, he saw God's provision in ways he never expected. Life had stabilized. He had a job, nothing prestigious, but it was enough. He had peace, even in uncertainty. But just when he thought the hardest part was over, God asked for more. One evening, Ethan sat across from David at the diner, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "I feel like I should be doing something more," Ethan admitted. "I don't know what, but I can't shake this feeling that I'm supposed to be helping people, that I'm supposed to be giving something back." David smiled knowingly. "That's the Holy Spirit nudging you. Have you prayed about it?" Ethan exhaled. "Not really. I guess I'm afraid of the answer." David chuckled. "That's fair. But remember what Jesus said, 'Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me.' Luke 9:23. Ethan stared at his friend. "Yeah, but what if the cross he's asking me to carry is too heavy?" David leaned in. "Then you lean on him to carry it." That night, Ethan wrestled with the thought. What if God was asking him to step out of his comfort zone, to serve, to give, to risk? He thought about the story of Abraham, called to leave everything familiar and step into the unknown, trusting that God's promises were bigger than his fears. "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." God didn't give Abraham a roadmap. He simply asked for obedience, and Ethan felt that same call echo in his heart. The next morning, he opened his Bible praying for clarity. His eyes fell on Isaiah 6:8. "Here am I. Send me." The words hit him like lightning. He had been asking God for direction, for a purpose beyond survival. And now, the answer was in front of him. God was calling him to step out, to say yes. But what did that mean? Did it mean quitting his job? Moving somewhere new? Serving in a ministry? Ethan didn't know. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid. Because obedience didn't require all the answers. It only required one thing, a willing heart. And so, with trembling hands but a steady spirit, Ethan whispered the words that would change everything. "Here am I, Lord. Send me." Ethan had said yes. Yes to God's call. Yes to stepping into something greater than himself. Yes to surrendering the safety of predictability for the adventure of faith. But saying yes was only the beginning. Now came the hard part, walking into the unknown. Ethan's decision wasn't met with immediate clarity. He expected some grand revelation, a clear sign pointing him to what was next. Instead, all he had was silence. Doubt crept in. Had he misunderstood God? Had he made a mistake? He thought about Peter, stepping out of the boat, walking on water toward Jesus. At first, Peter defied the impossible, but the moment he let fear take over, he began to sink. "Lord, save me," Peter cried, and immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. Matthew 14:30-31. Ethan didn't want to sink. So he did the only thing he could do. He kept moving forward. One afternoon, he met with his pastor, Pastor James, for advice. "I feel called to serve, but I don't know where," Ethan admitted. "I don't know how." Pastor James nodded thoughtfully. "You don't have to know everything, Ethan. You just have to take the next step. Sometimes obedience is walking without seeing the full path." He leaned back and smiled. "Have you ever considered working with the homeless ministry?" Ethan hesitated. I've never done anything like that before." Pastor James chuckled. Neither had Moses when God called him to lead a nation. Yet God told him, "I will be with you." Exodus 3:12. Ethan swallowed hard. Was this the step? That Saturday, he found himself in a small church kitchen, helping prepare meals for the homeless. It felt uncomfortable at first. He wasn't sure what to say, what to do. But as the night went on, he saw faces. real people with real struggles. He met an elderly woman named Linda who had lost her home after a medical emergency wiped out her savings. He met a veteran named Jake who carried scars that weren't just physical but deep within his soul. And then there was Marcus, a boy no older than 10, clinging to his mother's hand, his eyes filled with questions no child should have to ask. Ethan's heart broke, and suddenly he knew this was why God called him. Not for grand gestures, not for recognition, but for moments like these, for people like them. As he left that night, Ethan whispered a quiet prayer. "Thank you, Lord. I don't need to see the whole plan. I just need to trust you with the next step." And with that, he stepped forward. Ethan stood in the middle of the crowded shelter, his hands shaking as he held a warm cup of coffee. The room was filled with people, some worn down by years of hardship, others newly displaced, still trying to make sense of their reality. But tonight was different. Tonight, he had to make a choice. For months, he had walked the path of obedience, one uncertain step after another. He had learned to serve without expecting anything in return, to listen without trying to fix, to love without conditions. But there was still one thing God was asking of him: to trust him fully. Pastor James had approached him earlier that day. "We need someone to lead this ministry," he had said, his voice steady but full of meaning. "Someone who isn't just here to volunteer, but to give their heart to it." Ethan had been stunned. Lead? Him? He wasn't qualified. He wasn't experienced. He still had doubts, still had moments where he questioned whether he was making a difference at all. But then he remembered Peter. Peter wasn't perfect, but Jesus still called him to feed his sheep. John 21:17. He thought of Moses, who had doubted his own voice, yet was chosen to lead a nation. He thought of Paul, who once persecuted Christians, yet became the greatest missionary in history. And then he thought of Jesus. Jesus, who left heaven's throne to walk among the broken, the weary, the lost. Jesus, who didn't just speak of love, he became love in action. Ethan realized this was never about his qualifications. It was about his willingness. So now, as he looked around the shelter, his heart pounded with a quiet certainty. He saw Linda, the elderly woman who always smiled despite her struggles. He saw Jake, the veteran, who had finally found a reason to believe again. And he saw Marcus, the little boy who now ran to him every time he walked through the door, because Ethan had become his safe place. This was his calling, not in a church pulpit, not on a mission field across the world. Right here, among the least of these. Ethan took a deep breath and turned to Pastor James. "I'll do it." And at that moment, he understood. Surrender was never about losing. It was about gaining everything that truly mattered. Final reflection. In Matthew 16:25, Jesus said, "Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it." Ethan had thought that purpose was something he had to chase. Instead, he found it in surrender. He discovered that the greatest fulfillment doesn't come from status, wealth, or personal ambition. It comes from loving as Jesus loved, from serving as he served. A call to action. What about you? Are you searching for purpose? Are you waiting for a sign before you take that next step? Maybe the answer has been in front of you all along. Maybe God is calling you, right where you are, to trust him, to surrender, to serve. Will you say yes?